In beginning this first lecture, we are going to now show how the history of the church until the days of Johann Voss shut their eyes from seeing evil. This hatred of sin, which is in all true Christians, is seen throughout the Bible and church history, from the early church until the 1800s among ministers in America. The ministers who thought this way knew the text before us today in Isaiah 33, 14 through 15, and thus these faithful witnesses condemned the art of stage plays, in shutting our eyes to seeing evil from the early church fathers, including, but not limited to, Cyprian, Tertullian, Origen, Gregory of Nazianzen, Ambrose, Augustine, Chrysostom, and in the Reformers, and with the Puritans with William Perkins, William Ames, Richard Baxter, James Durham, Thomas Watson, Thomas Boston, James Fisher, John Brown of Haddington, Increase Mather, and more modern times with Samuel Miller, William Law, Charles Spurgeon, and J.C. Ryle, which have all condemned the art of stage playing, which is like our modern movies, which are nothing more than staged plays, as revealing sin for our eyes as sinful in their writings. This unanimous condemnation in regard to stage plays became very lax over 400 years ago. However, even during the times of most laxity within America, the Lord still had several faithful prophetic voices against this wickedness. These men were Increase Mather and Jonathan Edwards in the New England area, and Samuel Miller and James Alexander at Princeton Theological Seminary. The first prophetic voice we will examine is Increase Mather in 1612. Increase Mather was a faithful Puritan minister in New England who observed all sorts of iniquities forming around him. For while he saw other iniquities of public mixed dancing and Christmas idolatry, it was his condemnation of the iniquity of drama or stage plays, which is the equivalent to our modern movie, coming forth for the first time into the Church of America, which alarmed him most. Unlike most men in our day would do, he did not shrink from the battle, but sounded an alarm in a sermon calling for the faithful proclamation against these and other iniquities. When Mather made this proclamation, he said that he would not be in keeping with the spirit of the prophets in the Bible, who risked their lives to witness against these particular iniquities that the people were mixing with, if he failed to sound an alarm for the holiness of Christ in such a degenerate age. For Mather knew the text of Lamentation 2:14, which teaches, the false prophets in the Bible were recognized by failing to expose the outward iniquities of the people, thus bringing Israel into captivity. And thus, as John Calvin, in commenting on this verse, says, we can recognize the true prophet of God by his exposing the iniquities of the people of God. And we can recognize the false prophet by his failure to expose the iniquities to the people of God. This is why Martin Lloyd-Jones could say that false prophets are known by what they do not teach as much as what they do teach. I have discovered, says Martin Lloyd-Jones, over the years that subtraction from truth is something that members of churches are very slow to observe. I have almost come to the conclusion that the acid test to apply to know whether a preacher is evangelical or not is this: observe what he does not say. So often I have found that people have listened to a man and been carried away by him and thought everything wonderful for the reason that he had said nothing wrong. and they were quite right in their observation. The man had said nothing wrong, but the point was that he had not said things that an evangelical always must say. He had left them out. For Jones, the truth that Jeremiah clearly teaches us, that false prophets in Lamentations 2:14 were not recognized by a failure to preach much of God's word, but rather a failure to expose their iniquity to you. This teaching also goes with the teaching of Paul in 2 Timothy 2:19, that the Lord knows those are his, and they are not marked by having gifts of preaching. Matthew 7, many will prophesy in my name, and I will say, Lord, Lord, depart from me. And the Lord will say, depart from me, workers of iniquity. Nor praying, the Pharisees prayed long times in Matthew 6, but by abstaining and turning from all iniquity. 2 Timothy 2:19. Thus, what does that make leaders in the church who do not expose the iniquities of stage plays and movies as sinful, but rather promote stage plays and movies and persecute those trying to expose them? But false prophets, according to Lamentations 2:14, an increased matter. However, I personally believe there are many exceptions with regards to our day of darkness and apostasy. Since many leaders and those in the church do not see the sin or iniquity within movies. So it would be classified as an ignorant sin, not a willful sin. While ignorant and willful sins are both damning to hell, in some cases, I believe many cases it is not true in this regard. As earlier I stated, it took me 3 to 4 years to see this view, and many others it could take long as well. While Mather was direct and forthright, preaching against setting our eyes on evil at such things as drama, he was nothing compared to Jonathan Edwards on setting our eyes on sin at any time. The second prophetic voice, continuing the cry for holiness in America, we will examine is Jonathan Edwards in the 1700s. In one sermon excerpt from a modern book entitled The Torments of Hell, Edwards says that men and women do not just sin in their heart, but from out of their eyes they see. Or from out of the heart their eyes see. Edwards states, since all parts of the body were used in the service of sin, all parts of the body shall suffer torment for that sin. It is fitting, then appropriate, that eyes, ears, tongues, mouths, hands, and feet should be tormented all at the same time, to supply the bodies of damned souls with continual and universal torment. If the burning of one finger is so painful now, what will it be like when all parts of the body are burned and roasted in a furnace of fire that will make earthly fire seem cool? All the parts of the body that were employed in the service of sin, all their senses were diverted to sensual lust. They made not a covenant with their eyes, but suffered them to wander after forbidden objects. They improved their eyes to goad them in their pursuit of their lust. What does Edwards mean but that if you follow the lust of the eyes and watching others sinning in your movies without repenting, you will burn in hell? The third prophetic voice we will examine is Samuel Miller in 1812 against the dangerous practice of stage plays. This witness for Christ in holiness came about in a strange providential way as a fire broke out in a Virginia theater killing not only the actors involved, but several professing Christians in the city who were attending the stage play. It was the fire in Virginia which caused Presbyterian pastor and theologian Samuel Miller in 1812 of Princeton Theological Seminary to preach a sermon condemning the art of acting and thus stage plays, by linking the possible fire that night with the judgment of God on sin. While Miller in the sermon did not condemn those men and women to hell absolutely, or 100% say it was God's judgment, the sermon did call for intense examination of one's heart before God. Amazingly, in the sermon, Miller does not show the greatest sins or evils, or what the Reformers and Puritans condemned, but that all stage plays, even though this is what most leaders in the American church today say, that it was the most extreme sins. Rather, it was even the least sins or evils in stage plays, which are to be punished by God in eternal hell, as any willful sin, or in some cases, any ignorant sin. Now we will look at Samuel Miller and what he says people have always said about the sins in stage plays. Question: is it like most modern leaders say, it's the worst type sins? Or is it what Samuel Miller says, even the least sins? In the sermon, Miller shows from Scripture, not indifferent material things, but 5 main sins involved in all stage plays, such as idleness, a criminal waste of time, the bad company we see or we are around at stage plays, along with supporting their salaries or by our attendance, paying to watch them act out. And finally, the effects it has on Christian character, which all take our affections away from God. While most see stage plays and movies as indifferent rather than sinful, the truth is they are all sins against the 7th commandment, as stated by the Westminster Confession Larger Catechism. Also, the same godly men who put together the Catechism also put together a confession which teaches that true Christian liberty is not an indulging of sin, but an abstaining from and turning from all sin, the least sin and the least lust. This catechism is the one which Samuel Miller and all true Presbyterians swear to abide by, and are the very sins which lead to adultery. In closing this sermon, Miller shows that many will be called Calvinists and Puritans for such a strict view of holiness, but he stands solidly on living holy before Christ. In fact, in showing many people's objections to turning away from movies, Miller shows that the true Christian may be deceived, but if they are truly Christ, they will stop watching stage plays, or as stated, what is their equivalent, today's movies. He then finishes the sermon by showing that historically, to go to any stage play would be to put oneself away from the Lord's Supper and to risk eternal flames in cherishing one sin in the heart or life. He gives the examples of the early church, Reformation era, and the Puritan era, in showing us that the Protestant church had always used church discipline on the people for attending stage plays as going forth into known sin, or ignorantly going forth into dangerous sin. We see this as the synods, councils, and confessions in these eras of church history all condemn stage plays, which you can read from the prologue to James Durham's book, The Law Unsealed, or if you read Increase Mather or Cotton Mather's writing on stage plays. Do you realize that your leaders have risked your eternal soul in deceiving you either ignorantly or willfully, in saying that you can watch the least forms of evil with your eyes without suffering eternal burnings, whereas God says to shut your eyes to all evil to escape eternal burnings? Who is right, God or your leaders? Sadly, many, if not most, leaders today know that these men teach these truths regarding stage plays, but will not allow them to be shared with their congregations. Or, if they have shared these truths with their people, they appeal to these men as teaching that all stage plays that these men condemned were the worst forms of evil rather than small sins. In other words, they are telling you that since these stage plays back in the Reformed and Puritan days were gross sin, this does not apply, since we are only allowing you to watch some sin. And when men try to oppose these leaders' view on movies in the most loving spirit, many times they are politely told to shut their mouths or face the ridicule of being called fundamentalist or legalist or Pharisee among the people. The thing is, even if these leaders think that those opposing these movies are wrong, out of true Christian unity, as Paul, who would not drink meat or wine if it caused his brother or sister to sin, they too should give up their movies for the sake of their brother. However, rather than using self-denial and turning from these movies, these leaders persecute, promote, and mock those who say it is sinful to watch others sinning in movies, while at the same time they are also condemning all the previous early church, reformers, Puritans, and their successors as legalists, Pharisees, and fundamentalists who condemned stage plays. The fourth prophetic voice we will examine came as this concept of separation from the world began to change in the 1800s in the Reformed Church. James Alexander, another of Princeton Theological Seminary, gave this warning. The door at which those influences enter, which countervail parental instruction and example, I am persuaded, is yielding to the ways of good society by dress, looks, and amusements. An atmosphere is formed in which is not that of Christianity. More than ever do I feel that our families must stand in a kind but determined opposition to the fashions of the world, breasting its waves like the Eddystone Lighthouse. And I have found nothing yet which requires more courage and independence. From Alexander we see an important truth which we would do well to heed, and that is that those abstaining from worldly activities like movies were not legalistic or pharisaical, but desiring to be separate from all sin. From Alexander we see that he has found nothing yet which requires more courage, because it is most difficult to stand up for an issue that makes others think you are legalistic or pharisaical, nor independence, because most will think you are strange to not follow a multitude to do evil. If Alexander is right, that a society which is not Christianity is formed by our amusements and dress, now, what do those who have go to amusements and is Christianity at all? Thus far, we have seen some men who stood for holiness as opposed to worldliness. Now we will see the key proponents to overturning our leaders' view of worldliness. In this first lecture, we have sought to show that there has not only been a historical condemnation of stage plays, But in America, God raised up 4 men to preach against sin: Increase Mather, Jonathan Edwards, Samuel Miller, and James Alexander. For while there would be a condemnation of stage plays faithfully in America, from the time of Miller and Alexander until today, with the condemnation of movies with sin in them, Joel Beeke in the Dutch Church, the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, Chapel Library, who prints the Free Grace Broadcaster, Grace Gems, and the Covenanters, sadly, these are the only Christians who have opposed movies, with only a few other exceptions. In Lecture 1, we have seen how the Lord has raised up godly men to show the dangers of going to stage plays. And in Lecture 2, we will see how Satan has crept in to bring a view that the movies in themselves are not inherently evil, while hiding the fact that it is the hearing with the ears and the seeing with our eyes which has allowed the people of America